Once a jolly swagman camped by Billabong under the shade of a coolabah tree. He sang as he watched, waited till the billy boiled. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me, waltzing Matilda, waltzing Matilda, you'll come a waltzing.
Well, David and Jean McFerrin here. We're back to Ireland for a holiday after 55 years in Australia. We were both born in the Lower Ards. Jean was born up in a place called Cardy, and I was born outside Ballywalter on a property. The McFerrins had a number of properties around here. My father had 5 sons and 1 daughter, the eldest daughter Mary, and over the years we all went to Australia. We all moved out to Australia except Mary. Mary was left back and living in Bangor with, she married Jack Sheldon. The reason the flame was struck about Australia was the eldest son, John. He won a scholarship back in about the early 60s, and he went out to Australia and travelled around. I think he travelled about 5 states. And he came back to Ireland saying there were wonderful opportunities, particularly in Western Australia. There was cheap land and opportunity, new land being thrown open. Now, over the next 5 years, this began really in about 1964. I think Billy was one of the first to go out, and he went to New South Wales. Then Robert, another brother Robert, he went to Western Australia to the Wheat Belt. Jim, he went to Victoria, he was a teacher. And then Jean and I, we arrived out in Western Australia about 1968. Now, Jean will tell you about the boat trip out to Australia and the things that happened when we got to Australia.
So David and I got married on the 5th of June 1968, and we were one of the £10 people who immigrated out to Australia. We had gone out together for about 4.5 years, so I was very, very young when David started going out with me. And he actually tells the story of seeing my photograph at a young farmer's dance in the paper and cut it out and said to his best friend, William Gilmer, "That's the girl I'm going to marry." And he lived up to his word. We left home, as you know, I was very young. I was only 20 when I got married, but I thought I knew everything and had really very little thought of what it must have been for my parents to have their first daughter leave home and go so very far away, when the thought was in those days that you would probably never see them again. However, David and I were very much in love, and we just got on the boat from Southampton and off we went for our 4-week trip. We were very young and very naive and did not appreciate our cruise on the big cruiser. But we arrived in Fremantle on the 27th of July, and we were 2 of the last people to actually sail as immigrants to Australia. Everyone from then on flew, and we have got our names in the records over there to recording that. Anyway, we landed in Fremantle in the middle of winter on a beautiful sunny day and went off to live in Narrabeen in the Wheat Belt, where David's 2 brothers were working. And David sent me out to work for the first time, and I worked part-time in the doctor's surgery as a receptionist. And then David will take over the story from here, because he then started our next part of our life down in Basildon.
We had little knowledge. We didn't know what to expect when we first went up to the wheat belt. There was a great opportunity in the 60s of share farming with the wheat farmers, and my brother John was share farming and my brother Robert were share farming up in the wheat belt. I got a job in the CBH. That's where they receive all the grain from the wheat growing farmers. There was an opportunity came down in Busselton, which was probably 600 miles south of where we were in Narrabeen, and working on a large property. Actually, there were Charolais stud at that time in the 70s. So we moved down in early '69 to Busselton, where we have remained around that area for all these years. I was working on a property called Sabina Vale, a large property of 1,400 acres. It was owned by a wealthy businessman in Perth, and it was a wonderful experience, because it was another way of farming that I had no knowledge of at all. It was completely different to farming in Ireland. And we had irrigation. The seasons were totally different. The weather system was totally different. But we worked there for probably 5 or 6 years, and it was a great experience. And then the opportunity came to buy our own property. Now, we had no capital at all when we went out there. I think that was the wonderful thing about Australia in the 60s and 70s. So if you wanted to work hard, land was cheap, and there was generally some way of getting your foot, you can get to own some land. And the opportunity was given to us in the early 80s. But in the meantime, Jean and I, we've had to do a lot of things. From driving buses, Jean drove buses. I was driving trucks and buses and tourist buses to raise the capital to get started. And then we got an opportunity. In the meantime, I think Jean will tell you a little bit about the children. We were lucky enough, our children were born in the early 70s, so I think Jean will tell you a little bit about the family in those times.
Yes, so as David said, you know, we basically had nothing when we went out there, but we had each other, and I think that was the main thing. David's parents came out, John and Ellie McFerrin from Sandown. They came out and lived with David and I for 2 years, a year after we got married. And during that time we had our first child, Stuart, Alexander, and then about 2.5 years later along came Caroline. David's mum and dad lived with us for 2 years, and then they decided that Australia was where they wanted to be and amongst the boys, so they went back to Ireland and sold everything they had here and came out to Australia and settled there. They built their house and settled there for the rest of their lives, leaving Mary, David's sister, here by herself. So because I had no family out there apart from David's wonderful family, I felt very much for Mary being left here by herself. However, both Mary and I have done very well and survived very well with the family of love that we have around us. So then we, as David said, we got the opportunity to buy some land, and that meant that we both went out to work to try and survive and pay the deposits on the farm as we went. So I went and worked for friends who owned a bus company and did the office work and drove buses. for many years, about 7 years, and eventually we were able to do up the little cottage that was on the farm and move down there on Stuart's 10th birthday. And from there, David will continue the story of how we got into our farming life.
The dairy industry in Western Australia had a wonderful quota system, and this system was formed way back in the 30s, and you were allocated so many litres, you had to produce so many litres of milk per day. And back, I think it was 82, every year they would allocate maybe another 10 or dozen people, quotas to new producers. And that generally was started off at around 250 litres a day. Now, it mightn't sound much, but you were getting top price for it. You got your foot into the industry, you got your license. Then there was quota auctions every month, and you could go and you could buy more quota milk. And we did well from the dairy, and we were in dairying for 35 years until deregulation in the year 2000. And it threw the whole industry in West Australia into disarray. And we struggled on for probably another 4 or 5 years. And when I got to 70, I thought, well, we'll try and do something a little bit easier in the dairy, because it was so uncertain. The prices were bad. There was a lot of people left the industry. In Western Australia, in the late 80s, there were 600 producers. It had dropped to around about 200. It is now down as low as 130. But the farmers now in dairy, and they're milking a lot more cows. A small herd would be 350 up to 2,000. So it has settled down. But when we get out of dairying, lucky enough, the beef prices came good. So Jean reared a lot of Hereford Friesian cross heifers, and we crossed them with Hereford Angus bulls, and they have done well out of the beef this past 5 years. Farming in Australia, you're dependent solely, the weather is everything, rain is everything. And we live down in the southwest corner, about 150 miles south of Perth. In the 55 years that we've been down there, we've never had a drought. We've always had a fairly good season. We always were able to make enough hay and silage to feed out during the summer through the dry months. Where we live around Margaret River is a wine growing area. It's a tourist area, so I think we made a good choice back all those years ago. Land, let's say in the late 60s, you could have bought for $60 an acre, and when you can compare that to land in Ireland, if you had had a lot of capital, a fella could have done very well. Land prices now are the same as the rest of the world. Land is expensive, more because of the wine industry and a lifestyle property. There's 2 million people in Perth like to have holiday homes and maybe 10 acres of land or 20 acres of land for a lifestyle, so that has created inflated prices. Australia has been good to Jean and I. We've been blessed in so many ways. It's nice to come back to Ireland and to see the way the farmers farm the land here. They are still, in my opinion, some of the best farmers in the world, and to see how well they are all doing. Now, back 50 years ago, it was an amazing sight when one would go out in the months of April and May. They were clearing virgin country. Now, when you consider that the property Jean and I are on was first settled under 100 years ago. So 100 years ago in our area, there was only about 100 acres cleared in the whole area. So when we went out there, they pushed the trees over with dozers, and they put them into what was called windrows. And there was absolutely magnificent timber being pushed down. And every April, whenever the opening rains came, in other words, after the dry spell, the dry summer months, we would go out and we would light these rows. And there were tremendous heat and the fires were fierce. And you mainly burned it at night. And you had to get out with the dozers and keep pushing them up and pushing them up. Now once you got all the timber burned, there was all the little sticks and the rubbish and all, they all had to be lifted. Sometimes you had rakes you pulled with the tractor to clean them up. But there was a lot of hard work done in the early days in Australia. The early pioneers, let's say the people that went out there in the 20s and started to clear land, they had no machinery, it all was done with horses and picks and cross-cut saws. Now we have got huge loaders, four-wheel drive things, can just go out to a huge stump, dig it out of the ground, rattle it around, stack these in a big heap, burn them up. No hard labour as such compared to the early pioneers. Now when Jean and I got our property, there was 40 or 50 acres out the back where these stumps were still there, and there's a lot of dead timber and stones and that had to be gathered up by hand. So for a number of years, it really took us maybe 5 years to get all this rubbish cleaned up. But it is amazing how the environmental scene has changed around the world as far as pushing down trees. We are not allowed now to push down trees on the farm except to put in a fence line. If you go, I've got some timber, what we call bush. If I was to go and push that down, I would be very heavily fined. So the whole thing about burning trees, clearing land has changed completely in Australia for environmental reasons. On the farm itself, when Jean and I took over the property, it was just what you'd call an out farm. There was no buildings on it. There's a little old house which was called a group settlement house. Back in the 1920s, they had a group settlement scheme where they gave people come out, group of maybe 100 men would go out into the bush, clear a certain amount of an area of land. Then they drew straws to get so many acres, up to about 150 acres. And that's how they got the land. And they were provided with a little group settlement house, a very basic house. And the remains of that were on our property when we bought it. And we fixed that up. We spent a bit of time and a little bit of money and got it livable. And then once we got the house down, built and to live on the property, we built the shed, the milking parlour and the other sheds. And the other problem we had in the early days with Clovermore, Clovermore is what you call the property, was water. Water, if you haven't got water, if you're going to have 100 or 200 animals, in a hot day, a dairy cow will drink 70 litres a day. So you must have good water, and we had problems divining water. And eventually we did get a good source of water from the back of the property, which helped the dairying enterprise greatly. But it was worth all the work. There was hard work. Jean worked hard, we all worked. But I think that was the beauty about Australia. There was reward for your hard work, particularly in those days. If you had no capital, if you worked hard enough, you could make something. And Jean's going to say a little bit now about the other side of living in Australia.
So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the female side of being a farmer's wife. in Australia. With David and I, it was one of our wishes to work together and to build our life together. So from we first went onto the farm, there was many hot summers when we would just be constantly from daybreak to sunset collecting sticks, picking up sticks from paddock, rocks that had been dug up when David was cultivating. And that was for our children, Caroline and Stuart, part of their job too. So the children have been brought up that if you own a farm, everybody works from the daybreak to sunset, and I don't think it's been a bad thing for them. They've both done very well. Life in Australia has been, for me, a very good life. I've enjoyed the work on the farm. It has not done me any harm, obviously, and as being part of a very independent person, which I am, I decided that if we bought a farm, I would go out to work to earn an income to supplement us and provide the luxuries which you don't really pay much attention to when you're a farmer's wife. However, I went out to work as well as rear all the calves. So for me, morning was getting up 5:30 in the morning, making a cup of coffee, taking it down to the milking shed, and then starting my day, helping David hose the yards, milk the cows, but predominantly I was the calf rearer. And that I did enjoy. I loved my calves, and I loved the joy of rearing them and bringing them in. For the final 2 years of milking, we decided to put a Hereford bull over our Frisian cows, and for 2 years I reared every single calf that we had, and we leased land and housed them out so that when the time came for the cows to go, we already had an income coming in. I worked, as David has said, driving buses for 7 years, as well as working in the office of that company, two lovely friends. Then I started working to a dental surgery and trained to be a dental assistant and manage a dental practice, and I retired on the 30th of November this year after probably a good 50 years of working apart from the farm. David and I managed very well together because we both worked very well together. So, you know, part of the whole thing was that, you know, everyone helped. We worked with me going down to the shed. David would also be very good with me in doing things that I needed to do. So life wasn't really all that different. It is a very enjoyable life that we live in Australia. As David said, we live in the tourist side. When we first went out to live in Bastleton, we started attending what is now called Bay Life Uniting Church, which is Methodist Uniting and Presbyterian. And I think now, at this date, David and I are probably the longest standing members in that church, which is some achievement. The church is very much our family. Church on Sunday means the start of a wonderful start to a week. And we are very blessed with having many very, very close friends within the church, as well as a big group of friends out of the church as well. So I think we have quite a vast interest in life. David and I, when we went out there, as most people who knew David in Ballywalter down here, they were tormented with David's Mini Cooper driving up the road to our place in Cardi. And like our minister, the Reverend McElveen, Rhoda, Jack's sister, could never go to sleep at night until David had left our house and gone back to Sandend. So when we went to Australia, we were still very much involved in car clubs, car rallyings, and enjoying life in that way. David has now got a fully restored Mini Cooper S, which only David has ever driven. I've never sat in the driver's seat of her or been allowed to start the engine. So he is very precious about his Mini Cooper S. But life is great. We've got 2 children, as we said, and 6 grandchildren who live around us. And it is thanks to Stuart, our son, who's taken leave from his work as a surveyor in the mines at Rio Tinto, that he has taken leave to give David and I the opportunity to come here and have 6 weeks holiday. Life is very different in Australia for family-wise because there is such vast kilometres between things. Our children had to leave home at the age of 17 and go to live or reside in Perth, which is, as David said, 150 miles away, to go to university. So that was basically them leaving home and only being home for weekends or summer holidays, school holidays. So your children very much become very independent. They learn to cook very early in life and they learn to exist very early in life. But in saying that, the family still stays very close. We're still all very involved in family life, and I don't think if you look at David and I that you could do anything but admit that we've done very well out of our life over there. So yes, thank you for listening to me.
There's something I really enjoy in Australia is the wildlife. Now, on our property, I suppose the emblem of Australia is the kangaroo. Now, we have a lot of kangaroos out the back of the property. Now, about a month ago, I was out there early one morning, and there's up to about 50 kangaroos in the pasture. Well, when you get that sort of numbers, that's too many. You don't mind 4 or 5, so we've got roo shooters, and these are professional people who have got a license. And they will come out and they will cull maybe half a dozen each night, and they're taken back and put in freezers, and it's all used as pet food. But not only on the farm, we have got a few emus, just the odd emu. People think of Australia, think of snakes. Well, I'm out on the property all the time. And it's a thing I would never think about at all, believe it or not. They do at certain times of the year when they, the springtime they come out, you'll get them on the side of the road. But that's all, there's no bother with them at all, there's no danger. A snake always wants to get away from you. You can sometimes worry a little bit, they can bite a young calf in the foot or a cow. And the cow trods on them and they'll try and defend themselves, but that's the only danger with them. The wildlife, as far as the birds go, it is just Australia's an unbelievable country. There's just the dawn chorus in Australia is amazing. The noise every morning is absolutely amazing. The main thing you have to worry about in Australia is when you're in the ocean, are sharks. They are the things that we all fear the most. That's where there's probably, since we past few years, there's been probably half a dozen people in our area. They're people that are out surfing, not the people that are swimming on the beach, it's the people that are out surfing on their surfboards out in the ocean a little bit. But it's their home, it's their ocean, so we are the one that's probably shouldn't be there, so that's the one risk. But we have problems with the pastures, with beetles. We've got plenty of insects that we have to spray to kill red mite, which can destroy the pasture. We have a beetle that was brought in from South Africa, believe it or not, to control the grass in the waterways up in the irrigation country about 100 miles north of us. They came down, they have no predators, so they eat the pasture, and they're a disaster. We have to spray for those. make hay and silage October and November. And all the land that we cut for hay and silage, I have to reseed. So we have maybe 150, 200 acres a year that we have to go out and drill in. It'll about 20 kilograms per hectare or more with ryegrasses and that. So it is an annual pasture. So in other words, it has to grow from seed each year. There are bits and pieces in the farm that are perennial grasses, but mostly in Western Australia, unless it's under irrigation, it is an annual pasture. So we have to reseed each year, it's quite a cost. But we have other savings because of all the animals Jean and I have in the property, they're never housed, they're never in a house, which means we don't have the expense of slurry tankers, the slurry, housing kettle and all that. So this is why we can keep our costs down in our production of beef and milk.
Once a jolly swagman camped by Billabong under the shade of a coolabah tree. He sang as he watched, waited till the billy boiled. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me, waltzing Matilda, waltzing Matilda. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. Sang as he watched, waited till the billy boiled. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me, waltzing Matilda, waltzing Matilda. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. Sang as he watched, waited till the billy boiled. You'll come a waltzing Matilda.